housekeeping things. If you'll be sure, mute yourself so we can minimize feedback. If you don't mind to put your name in the chat so we can keep track of attendance. And if you're not getting emails from me and would like to, if you'll add your email as well. And we're going to be talking today with Danyelle Smith. I'm excited. She has so much knowledge on the topic of human trafficking. So we're going to learn a lot from her. She's going to talk to us some about how she sees trauma in this population and things that she does to help increase resilience and some of the ways that she stays well. We're really informal. If you've not been here before, don't wait for us to take a breath. You're welcome to unmute and jump in with a question or a thought. We're also watching chat. So if you want to type your comment in chat instead, we'll be watching that. We'll read it for everybody and let Danyelle answer it that way. Then we'll also provide a few minutes at the end for questions if we have the time to do that. So welcome, Danyelle. It's good to see you. I appreciate you making time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And so if you'll tell everybody what you consider to be your roles in the community, and then let us know experiences in working with human trafficking. Yeah,
absolutely. So my name's Danyelle, and I have actually lived in Boone now for about 10 years. That includes my undergrad career. Then I came back after graduating from undergrad, worked in insurance for State Farm Insurance. Did that for about 5 years prior to getting my MSW and trying to figure out what exactly or how I wanted to enter the anti-trafficking field. So in undergrad, I got my undergrad degree in global studies and did an intern with an organization called Liberty in North Korea. And that's where I first started learning about human trafficking, learning about how many North Korean refugees are trafficked in China as brides or through sex trafficking. And so from there, I had done a thesis on human trafficking domestic minors in the United States and knew that I wanted to have a role in the anti-trafficking movement, but after undergrad, didn't really know what that was going to look like. So fast forward, did the insurance thing for a little bit, and then got my master's of social work at ASU as well. So have been in this community for quite some time. Interned with a safe home for everyone. So I have some of the background in domestic violence and sexual assault. I worked at Grandfather Home for a short stint. So some experience working with youth in that population. And then did an internship with Project Fight through the Salvation Army, as well as the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. So I have some varied knowledge on human trafficking and showed up in different fields and some different community partners, as well as direct work. My last role was working as a case manager for survivors of human trafficking here in Boone in the greater High Country area. So I've been doing that for about 2 years now. And am currently in a transition. So I did leave Project Fight in December and am working out what the next steps exactly look like. I definitely continue to be serving this community. And I'm also currently teaching part-time at ASU in the social work department. So wear lots of different hats and can look at this issue from a lot of different intersections and lenses, which I think is really vital anytime we talk about trauma in any of the fields that we may work in. Where do you want me to go next, Denise?
Hold on, I had myself muted, sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
You may be planning to cover this in a few minutes, but one thing that was a little surprising to me, and I have seen be surprising to other people, is that we think of the high country as kind of apart from, you know, big city problems. Mm-hmm. And so some of the numbers that you shared with me the last time that we talked were surprising. Can you just give us a little context for?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start off just to give context for everybody in this conversation, just a brief definition of human trafficking, just to lay that groundwork that we're all on the same page. So within human trafficking, you have sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Human trafficking, the umbrella. So sex trafficking is when somebody uses force, fraud, or coercion to cause another individual to do a commercial sex act. Commercial sex act could be something like pornography. It could be stripping to like sex work. And it does not have, it can be for anything of value. So a lot of people think there has to be money exchanged for it to have a commercial element, but it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It can be substances, it can be housing, basic needs. With youth, it could be like technology. I've worked cases where somebody bought plane tickets. So anything of value. And I think that's really important. The next thing that's very, very important with sex trafficking is that if an individual is younger than 18 and there is any type of commercial element, force, fraud, and coercion doesn't have to be present. It's automatically sex trafficking if it is there's any type of commercial element. There's no such thing as a child prostitute. We harm so much more when we use language like that. So that's one thing that anytime I'm talking to anybody, if that's the one thing you take away, we've done our job at doing something. And then the other piece of that is labor trafficking, which is the exploitation using force, fraud, or coercion in order for somebody to give domestic services or labor. And when we talk about this, it can be anything. We often talk about the action means purpose model. And so actions can include recruiting, transporting, providing the service itself. It can even be patronizing or soliciting. So sometimes in the field, I've worked with people who are like, oh, well, the individual hasn't engaged in the commercial sex act yet. Well, if what somebody was soliciting them or patronizing them, that's part of the overarching definition. And so I just think it's important to kind of break some of these things down. Transportation does not have to be included. I know that's something that people often have a misconception because of the word trafficking, but transportation doesn't have to be included within that. So that's kind of just that basic definition of what we're working on. So when I talk about human trafficking, I'm talking about sex and labor trafficking. And of course, how we see those things present themselves in the community, they may look different, but there also is going to be some similar things. And so then to kind of talk about numbers and to kind of get with what Denise was kind of asking about, the shock of it happening here in the high country. So in 2019, the National Human Trafficking Hotline reported that there was 216 cases identified of human trafficking in North Carolina. However, what I know from working in the field and working with agencies is that only a small portion of referrals come from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So in my last role, about 10% of our referrals came from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which means statistically, we're not the National Hotline is not capturing all of the incidents of human trafficking. So it's a much larger issue than even those 216 cases. In about a year and a half of being a case manager here in the high country, I don't have my exact numbers in front of me, but I served probably between 30 to 40 individuals. From those 30 and 40 individuals that I served, I would say a little over half of them were trafficked here in the high country. So not necessarily in Watauga. So my area really, I ended up working Watauga, Ash, Allegheny, Wilkes, Avery, Caldwell, Catawba, Mitchell. So really this Northwestern region. And so it is not something that only happens in Charlotte. There's also a misconception that the individuals that I was serving were being relocated here. Yes, that happens, and sometimes that has to happen for safety of individuals, but I was also serving local clients. And what I'll say even is those local clients are often too can present some of the most challenges, because if they don't want to leave our community, we only have so many resources, then we kind of are stuck. We may have so many great resources in the community, but unfortunately they still don't always meet the needs of every individual. And I think any of us working in agencies throughout the high country know that that's a fact. And so like I said, it does happen here. I will say predominantly the clients that I was serving were clients that had experienced sex trafficking, and they were predominantly women. However, we have to kind of think too and break down the statistics again. Statistics are you can only take them for face value, right? So one, it is a lot more stigmatizing for male identifying individuals to come forward about sexual assault, domestic violence, really any type of violence. And so we have to take that in consideration. It does not mean that it's not happening and that we don't need to be concerned about male identifying individuals within our agencies as well. The other thing with that too is that people can see sex trafficking a little easier than labor trafficking because it's something that I believe that in general, we have spread a lot more awareness about that. I think part of that too is some whitewashing. In order to get individuals interested about an issue, we try to make it relate to them. So there's been a lot of pictures of, it can be this young, white, beautiful girl. Yes, that's true. But what I will say is that survivors of human trafficking can be of all demographics. And so what we do often is, or what I've seen often is that we can get a pigeonhole idea of what an individual or a victim looks like, and we could be missing others. And so I think that's one other thing that we really have to challenge ourselves of what does a survivor look like? And the honest is it could be anybody. Could have been anybody that's in this, in this talk. It could be anybody that we serve. And that's difficult for people to wrap their minds around because they want to know exactly what to look for. But that's just not the case. There's one thing that is in common with every survivor is that there's some type of vulnerability that they have that makes them vulnerable to being trafficked in the first place. That's whether you're talking labor trafficking or sex trafficking, whether you're talking about minors or adults. And so looking at those vulnerabilities, it could be anything from experiencing poverty to experiencing homelessness, to having a lack of support. So I know we're going to talk about what are good, positive things, and we all know that one of the biggest things if an individual who has a high ACE score is having that one supportive adult in your life. And so thinking that being a huge vulnerability that if a child does not have that. And I would go further to say adults do not have other community healthy and safe individuals too, like taking it from the child to the adult, because that's also an issue. And it can also just be things as like past history of abuse. Things that I see often is my clients struggling with substance use. So when we talk about human trafficking, we can't just talk about human trafficking. We have to talk about all of the intersections because it is not a standalone issue. I think if we went line by line of who's in this group and I asked, where do you work? I could come up with, well, how could this present in your job, whether it is a client you're serving, or even in the business sector, how does the business sector intersect with trafficking? So I think that's another thing that's really important. And I'm going to pause because I could just go on and on.
I know you said it's really all demographics, and you spoke to the male and female demographics. Of the 40 that you worked with, was there a age group that was more common, or was it just across the board?
It was across the board. So I will say when you look at the demographics that I have served, they mirror our demographics in some ways. And so, majority of my clients were white. But though I did have some Latino clients and some African American clients. And as far as age goes, they really vary. I had a few clients that were in their 50s to 60s, multiple clients in their 40s and 50s. Yeah, I mean, it goes from my youngest client was probably the youngest client, like that was one of my clients here in the high country, was 13, and my oldest client was 62. So it can be among all different demographics. And for those clients who are, in their 50s, 40s, 50s, One of them had been out of their trafficking situation for a very long time, but was going through the legal process to get a T visa. So there's a trafficking visa for individuals who've experienced trafficking to be able to gain documentation to be here in the United States. And so that client had been out of her trafficking situation for a very long time. But that was my only client that had been out of the trafficking situation for a long time. So it can happen amongst individuals of all ages.
I know this to be true in schools. They want us to give them a checklist or a bunch of boxes about what does this look like? How can we identify it? And so I know that it's impossible to do that with trauma, and at least even in the schools, because it's it's like you said, it's all demographics. But are there some common symptoms or traits or characteristics that maybe can alert you to a dangerous situation?
Yeah, I think one thing is like commonly they overlap with trauma in general. Oftentimes things are going to first present like trauma would. So some mental health, potentially going from being connected, well connected with friends to no longer being connected with friends. One of the things that we often talk about with minors is if they are, all of a sudden have an older boyfriend, or all of a sudden go from not having a nice phone to having a really nice phone and nice things. It's not uncommon for, especially when we talk about more of like youth and adolescent, for a trafficker to shower them with goods and, pose as a romantic partner and then end up exploiting them. So that's one thing. I think though, and then when we talk about some of the aspects of if an individual is undocumented, not having access to their papers, not having access to their identification, multiple visits to the emergency room. So those are some of them, but like I said, it really is, I feel like most often when I'm getting a referral, it is from a community partner that says, something's not adding up here. And so being able to kind of recognize some of those different pieces, but then, yeah, I know that's not a very simple, straightforward, and I struggle with this because during every training, people want to know, and I can list off a ton of indicators, but what it really comes down to is being able to, one, ask some of those harder questions depending on what your role is with individuals. And so, for instance, I've worked with Molly and Ashley at the Mediation and Restorative Justice Center to be able to ask some questions for inmates coming in to have you ever felt pressured to have sex with somebody? Some of those type of questions that get to, or have you ever felt pressured to have sex or work that you didn't agree to? Or are you getting paid what you were told you were going to get paid? So it's kind of more relationship based and asking questions versus being able to check off boxes, if that makes sense. And that even with that, even asking those hard questions, so often it's going to take a couple times to ask those questions because individuals may not feel safe, or they may not, oftentimes don't recognize it at first of what they're experiencing isn't right. I know that some of the referrals that I've gotten from folks is that they see that, well, that doesn't seem like a healthy relationship, but the individual isn't identifying it yet. Can you have a conversation? And that's one thing with the background that I have and working with folks is that I can have a conversation with an individual and say, well, can you explain a little bit what's going on right now? And then if they're not completely saying it, I can say, well, oftentimes I work with people who experience X, Y, and Z. And that is never it's never a script. It's just based off of the information that I've gathered and the different clients that I've had, to be able to try to connect with folks with how other people may present or understand, and always coming from a place of no judgment, and making that known, whatever you share stays between us, except for if it has to do with a minor, all the typical confidentiality stuff, but and then saying, I've worked with a lot of people who've been in situations like you. We often talk about with trauma, it can be so easy to think that we're the only one experiencing something like this. And in reality, unfortunately, with any type of trauma, there's lots of people who have experienced similar things. Maybe never the exact same thing, but still definitely parallels.
One thing that you said that really struck me is a noticeable change, like either from being clean and well put together and outgoing to not, or not having phones and clothes and then does. And another thing I thought of when you were talking, my guess is you've had more than one conversation with at least more than one person where you said, I'm here, if this is what's happening to you, let me know. And it took some period of time for them to feel like just probably similar to domestic violence relationships.
Exactly. It's very similar when you think about survivors of domestic violence and, how many times does it take to try to leave a situation? I think statistics typically show 7 to 8 times to actually try to leave the situation, to actually leave the trafficking situation. And I know that that's something that a lot of folks struggle with, is why don't they just leave? And it's because trauma bonds, feeling like they don't have any other options. If they don't have any support, honestly, the majority of the clients that I am their support. And so when we talk about healing, I can kind of transition to that if we're ready for that. But, that is a very difficult thing for this population, because oftentimes we think if you're out of the situation, okay, now you're out, so you're good. And it's like, no, we have to rebuild that life. And oftentimes folks have been so isolated and maybe have never had a healthy connection. So what does it even look like to have a healthy connection with another person? I spent a lot of time modeling behaviors and explaining my role and explaining even relationships that I have with other people, to then again model what relationships can look like. Because, even for my adult clients, they come from such a history of trauma that they've never experienced a healthy and safe relationship. And so how do we help, especially when we're thinking about our adult community members, how do we help them be able to connect and have those healthy connections throughout the community? Because as many of the great resources we may have, I think that there is a lack in building that further community, especially for you. Then you add on layers of that, of being afraid to connect with somebody. So I think it's a very difficult thing that we really have to take a strong look at, of how do we move forward for an individual that may have never had that before. And also recognize that it's going to take time. I think that's something that has been so beautiful about these conversations, and even hearing other community members who may have professional roles in the community and working with trauma, but also share their own trauma background, is something we always hear is we're all still working on it. I know I'm still working on it. I had therapy this morning, and so even though we may be in the helping profession, it's a life work, right? And so we have to remember that with the folks that we serve. And I think that especially with the population that I work with survivors of human trafficking, I see a trend of just thinking just because they're out of their situation, now they're expected to live a normal, or whatever, however you want to state that, whatever society says that they should be doing. And we often don't give them that platform and that time to heal. Even just talking about housing, it's they get into a program and it's great to have shelter, but there's this ticking timeline of, okay, well, you're expected to get into some type of permanent housing within 3 months. And it's how difficult is that for an individual who has not experienced human trafficking, let alone if you are talking about somebody who has been with the same trafficker for a year, 2 years, and maybe doesn't even have the life skills of what does it look like to live alone. So I think those are some barriers, especially even when we talk about healing. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think that conversations like this are so important because and taking it past that level of just what does this look like, but how do we truly work on creating a better system for folks to find healing that have experienced trafficking.
Yeah, that's a good point. We may come back to that, but there was a question in the chat. Do a lot of the people that you work with have intellectual or developmental disabilities?
Some of them. I wouldn't say more than, like, not 50%. Well, here, yeah, that's a hard question. So I would say as far as cognitive and developmental disabilities, maybe 20%. I could be off on that, y'all. I will say that a lot of them end up having some type of physical disability at some point, or like a mental health diagnosis that qualifies for disability, but that we all know that that process takes forever too. Yeah. So
when you were talking about the trauma recovery, when we do the WCCI presentation, I used to think before I got educated in trauma that you take somebody out of a trauma situation and give them some counseling, they should be fine soon. And now that we know so much about the impact on brains and how brains that are engineered in trauma have different pathways and hyperarousal and are prone to either fight, flight, or freeze. And so you get somebody that's been, and not only that, that usually victims are polywictimization.
absolutely.
They've been victimized before and are likely to be victimized again. And so I think your point is an excellent one, that the identification is just kind of like the start of, how do we help this person recover to create a thriving life?
Yeah.
And so that it does take time. It's not just about some counseling, that's about actual changing the pathways in the brain and helping them learn how to not be victimized. Those are all really huge, huge tasks to undertake. So.
Yeah. And kind of to go along in that line too, and mostly because I don't want to forget it, but like as thinking about this conversation, I think what's so important too is to recognize that because this is not a siloed issue, anybody that is in our community that is working with youth or working with individuals experiencing homelessness or is a therapist, all of us are technically all human trafficking preventionists. And so I think that's too is like inviting people to the table, because I think so often, and this is definitely just even early in my career, I was like, oh, well, I want to do anti-trafficking work. And it's like all the other things are anti-trafficking work, the work that Molly's doing within the jail and, with the LEAD program and that Ashley's doing, doing like peer support and all of that work, that is prevention. They may intervene also, but there's also prevention work happening there. I would say any school counselor is doing prevention work because of all of those intersectionalities. And I think it's important for us to see that, that's why I, come from a history of trauma myself, and years ago learned about ACEs, and that is part of what brought me to WCCI, but also saying that being part of WCCI is also prevention work, and my role as an anti-human trafficking specialist too, because it all starts with that trauma of some sort or some sort of vulnerability, right? So
yeah, makes
one
sense.
thing that I want everybody to kind of take home too, as far as I think we all have a place at the table in doing some of this work.
Well, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, the resilience factor, protective factor of a relationship with a positive, consistent, caring adult. We talk about that all the time as a factor to offset trauma. And when we've given presentations, there's been people in the audience who've said, so the thing that I can do is have a positive relationship with people. And I think if you have not lived in trauma, you don't understand how rare that is, that you don't even know what that looks like or how that feels. And so to be able to have positive, consistent interactions with someone helps them get used to, this is normal and this what feels good about this. I may not have ever known this before.
Yeah. And I think too, I had a pivotal moment when I was first interning. with Project Fight, actually in the Raleigh area, and went and with our lead case manager to meet with a young woman who was about they were probably 2 to 3 years younger than me, lived in the same county that I went to high school, went to a high school, we had 2 high schools in our county, went to the other high school. And as she shared about her life and what got to where she was sitting in that jail, I was stunned because there were so many parallels to our early childhood that I thought to myself, and knowing at this point already about ACEs, the only reason why our places aren't switched is because I was fortunate to have some positive adults in my life. Teachers who took me in. I mean, I would go to the guidance counselor's office and sit in there for a while if I didn't want to go to office or what, and they saw, not just wanting to do calculus, saw what's going on in my circle. And that is why I'm here talking to you all, and I'm not a victim of trafficking. I think that is a large part of that. I'm not saying that I would have absolutely, but I'm just saying, like, that is the difference. I saw that difference when I was sitting across the table with somebody who was from a similar area, similar background. And I think that that's so powerful, absolutely powerful.
I agree with you. So let's talk a little bit, if you're hearing feedback, I'm sorry. Let's talk a little bit about how you help others find strength and create resilience and build support.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing when I'm working with an individual is that, when talking about social workers, it's our number one tenet of treating people with dignity and respect. Strongly believing in giving everybody self-determination. And so do I say those words to my client? No, but I model those to my clients and am constantly telling them that they are worthy, of the services that they're getting from other service agencies, whether that's housing, that they're worthy of applying for SNAP benefits, that, like all of these things that are oftentimes we stick in society, that they're there for a reason, and that this is just part of their story. It doesn't make them who they are. And so I think constantly speaking worth into clients is often where that starts. And I, especially with the transition that I just recently did with moving out of my, I had to transfer my clients' care to other individuals, and the feedback even from clients of like, oh, well, you made me feel like I mattered. And unfortunately, the clients that I work with, because of all of the intersectionalities, they may not be the easy client. I get so frustrated often within the community, because so often we see other providers, unfortunately, who deem certain people worthy or unworthy. It's a sad fact that we do see, and that I even within colleagues that I love and admire, but it is something that happens there. And I think it can be similar to, when we talk about just all the different intersectionalities of my clients, is that they often have already sought services from other agencies. They may not have been presenting with human trafficking, but they have sought services and maybe have burned bridges. And so I think one thing that I challenge everybody within this community and who believes in this work is checking our bias, and checking when we are frustrated with a client's behavior, taking a minute and stop making it about us or our services, taking that deep breath and really remembering that they are a person in need too. And I understand, like, we could get in a whole thing about if an agency has rules or whatever, I get that. But what I see too often is that worth is being taken away. And I think that is the one thing that we have to challenge ourselves to hold true for everybody, no matter how difficult they are. And I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm not saying that I haven't gone home and vented about how difficult a client's been. I'm human too, but the way I treat my client is not in that way. And so I think that is probably the number one thing. Connecting them with mental health services, trying hard to connect them with mental health services that will be adequate. So, if they only have access to group therapy, they're not at a place to be able to be in group therapy. Maybe a support group of folks who've experienced sexual violence or whatnot, but not typically group therapy. And so worked really hard in building up a network. There's a really great therapist that does pro bono work, and COVID has made things a little bit easier with this because everything's telehealth. And so being able to connect with a provider who specializes in human trafficking and trying to get clients to meet with that provider instead of going to a community health for like doing community health mental health. That's great. Not bashing it. I'm just saying, like, if we can get somebody more specialized, that often see my client able to work through things a little bit easier. I think too, connecting them just with medical care. A lot of times clients have multiple mental health diagnoses, and medication can help. And so making sure that they are regularly going to the doctor and being connected to those services so that if they need to be on a medication, that can be consistent, because that in itself, that consistency can provide just that little bit of a step forward, and that the stability in order to start moving on through some of the harder things. I think that one of the things that is most difficult is connecting to other community supports. And part of that is, in an ideal world, I would be able to train a bunch of people to then like be mentors or something. But also just unfortunately with the anti-trafficking movement, services are limited as it is for intervention in those immediate direct service needs. And so I think that's where we need to move as a movement, is really starting to challenge ourselves of thinking just past that initial intervention and really providing those additional supports for survivors. And it's difficult when, you even look at my role in the high country, and I have clients. Not all of my clients are in Watauga. They're in Watauga and Ash, and every single county has different resources and, all of those things. And so that can be difficult. I will say that, and then it's difficult because like for some of my clients, they do really well being in a communal shelter, like in a domestic violence shelter, where they can make those connections a little bit easier. But it's really great for some folks, and it's not a perfect solution for others. Sometimes those situations it can actually be more unsafe, or if individuals, if they become friends with somebody who is still in that cycle of trauma, then hurting and re-exploiting them. And so it's difficult because there's not a one-off solution. And I think a better solution would be to have better community supports and like mentorship and, things like that, that we see pockets of, but is something I think we need to put more of a focus on. Oh, you're muted, Denise.
Thank you. I'm trying to minimize my feedback. Thank you. So lots of good tips about being fully present and being present for the pace that people need to go and those types of things. And so we've had several people on here that I think it just must be really difficult to take good care of yourself with the things that you hear. And this would be one of those. So what are some ways that you have found that you're able to promote your own healing and wellness, especially since we're a trauma-informed group? You bring up that you have your own history of trauma. Mm-hmm. So what are some things that you do?
Yeah, so I think one of my biggest things is having a therapist and going to therapy regularly. I had gone to therapy prior to getting my master's, which was really useful and helpful. And then as I moved through my master's degree, recognizing that I was already experiencing some vicarious trauma and knowing that it was only going to get worse. And so recognizing that and getting connected to a really great therapist here in town. So, therapy for myself. The other thing is having a really strong support network. And so really leaning on my friends. I am super fortunate that I have a lot of friends who work in the mental health field. And so they just get it. I have some really great colleagues that have turned into best friends. And I think, I mean, ultimately, like those are the people who on the day get me through it. And that I often am reminded of, like, when we want to turn inside and not reach out, needing to push to reach out, because that makes all of the difference. And a lot of that too is, even as I've done this work, you know, I had some really solid friends that were also colleagues prior to doing the anti-trafficking work here in the High Country. And what I've also found is building just relationships with all my community partners. And so within every agency that I work with on a regular basis, I would say I have at least one person who, when they ask me how am I doing, I tell them how I am doing. And I think that has led to friendships, obviously, right? But I do think that I heavily rely on support from the greater community, who also gets it. May not get it fully, but I know it's definitely helped me to, especially because of confidentiality. And then also just like, if you haven't worked with this population, I could tell you all day long, but you're not necessarily going to get it, right? And so really recognizing, like, I've had some really difficult situations of like leaning on my coworkers who've also worked with a similar client. And so being able to share that connection with a client. And that's also where a lot of my relationships have been built within the community, is if I'm working with another community partner with the same client, being able to just have that support. So I would say that's another huge one. And then being outdoors is probably the number one thing that helps restore me. Going for walks with my dog, being outside. I love to hike. I got a mountain bike. My partner bought me a mountain bike for my graduation gift. And so that's been something that we've been doing in the last 2 years. That has been really helpful just to get out some energy. Was rock climbing a lot before, like throughout grad school. Mountain biking kind of took that over, and then COVID happened. So there's some, but really just like getting outside and doing outdoor sports has been a huge area for me to kind of feel the feelings, but then also feel restored too. So it's one of my social connections, then being outside.
When I'm listening to you talking, I'm thinking about boundaries, because my guess is that your job was not 9 to 5. And so what are some things that you did to help maintain boundaries and not burn out and those kinds of things?
Yeah. So, one of the biggest things is that in my prior role would be on call about every 5 weeks for a whole week. So you'd be the person who had to pick up the hotline. And then during those weeks, I wouldn't get any sleep because you're just worried about missing a call. And I also, like, on our team, was the person that always had the most calls. It just always happened. It became a joke. And so really on the weeks that I was not on call, leaving my work phone at work. Or if I brought it home, turning off my work cell phone and putting it in, leaving it in my work purse. Because your clients will call you 24/7 and they will text you and they will say it's an emergency, but it's an emergency in their eyes, but it's not a actual work emergency. And so I know that some of my coworkers had a really hard time of just leaving their phones on. And I would have to say I was really good about leaving my work phone in my purse and turning it off. That was probably one of the bigger things. I think too, walking, like being able to have the time after work to transition. So I work in town, my partner works in Mountain City, and so he has a commute. And so typically I had, 30 minutes to an hour by myself before anybody else was home. And so taking the dog for a walk, kind of letting myself process through anything, but then saying, okay, I'm going to move this into a box and we'll open it tomorrow morning. And it's been interesting with some of the self-work that I've been doing is that I'm really good at compartmentalizing. It's not always a great thing, y'all, but when you're talking about trauma and boundaries, that is a moment where it's good to put things, the visual that I always use is putting it in a mailbox, and I'll check the mailbox in the morning. And so really trying hard to not take things home. And then I'd say one of the other thing with boundaries is being so close to colleagues and having friends as colleagues is trying to really practice consent when talking about, do you have space for this? And then if it being after hours, really trying not to just keep talking about work. It's one thing if it's been a really hard day, but not making a habit out of that. And I think that I'm fortunate that, a lot of the people that I work with come from a background of practicing consent. And so that I would say is also another strong thing that I think has helped me within my personal relationships too, to kind of have that set those boundaries. And then with my clients, like letting them know, like on my voicemail, it would go through this whole thing of like, if you've reached me, if you get this voicemail and it's an emergency, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, ask for Project Fight. And so there were things built into when working with clients that they had the clear steps of what to do, even if they forgot it. So if they're calling me, they're getting that message, which is going to remind them, because we all know if somebody is constantly in crisis, they're not going to remember those things. So kind of building that into with that, building the relationships with the clients.
It's very interesting to me. You talked about the visual, because when I first started this work as a social worker, so not only, number one, I was the only social worker in every school, so very intense. I also had a history of trauma, and so had a hard time with boundaries. And a therapist that I was working with told me I needed a visual for leaving stuff at work, and mine was a box by the door. And when I went out, I threw it in there and shut it. And when I came back the next day, I took it out.
Yeah.
And that helped me for a really long time of trying to figure out those boundaries. So my guess is we either have visuals already, or we may find that it's helpful for us to, especially if we struggle with compartmentalization or boundaries, to have ways to visualize, separating ourselves from other people's trauma and taking better care of ourselves. That's very interesting for me to hear you say that.
Yeah.
Maybe the same therapist. Maybe all therapists do that. All right, so I'm going to we're going to stop just a second and let people, you're welcome to unmute and talk directly to Danyelle if you prefer to put something in the chat. Somebody said that they have to go, but thank you. And so, if you haven't been here before, anything that you post in the chat, I'll copy and paste and email to Danyelle so she has your comments. If you'd like to put anything there, and then if you'd like to ask anything, I'm going to be quiet for a second while you find your mute button so you can unmute and ask for a question if you have one.
I have a question. Hey, Danyelle.
Okay.
So I know you touched on this briefly, and I know that you've been doing a lot of work in building awareness across the high country about human trafficking and what that does look like and how hard it is to identify. And years ago, I used to do some of this work. We actually worked a little bit together for a bit, but it used to be that the clients themselves, the few that I worked with, never came in and said, "Hi, I need services. I'm being human trafficked." Is that changing? No,
not really. You have a few, that will have the language, but most often those are the clients who have already sought services prior, and have the language a little bit more for it. But most often they don't, if they have not already worked with another service provider, they're not self-identifying. And so for the majority of clients that I'm still working, like that I've been working with, they're not identifying it until we have a conversation. So I think that brings up a really good point that, it's still, and, even once clients know, oftentimes clients don't want to say it either. And so that's something that, when I'm working with a new client, they don't have to say I'm being trafficked. I say, you know, these are the services, or when I was in my last role, he's like, these are the services that we provide. And we would say who we provided it for. And I'd say, you know, and it sounds like, based off of what you're sharing with me, that you fit the scope of these services. Are these services something that you would like to use, or that you would like to, you know, be part of our program? And so never making them even use that language if they're not ready, because so often they're not, and they may not. And honestly, everybody identifies their experiences very differently. So they may never actually use the same words that we may use. So, yeah. Thank you, Amber.
Do you think awareness across the board is getting a little bit better with community partners?
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot more work to be done. You know, even within the role that I had at Project Fight, I would say that I got to a point where I had a solid caseload of 16 to 17 individuals at any given time, and it became almost impossible for me personally to be able to do the awareness that I'd like to see. And so I do think that there's some more coalition building to happen and kind of sharing those things. So, you know, when I stepped into the role as case manager here in the High Country a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now, we didn't have any clients. And then by that November, I had probably 9 clients. And when I got back from last year around this time, all throughout 2020, I consistently had anywhere between 13 to 17 clients, which is a large caseload. And sometimes I actually had like 20 clients. Ideally, we would be between 10 and 15, and that's even stretching it. And so I do think that while we've had some really great awareness, and I think that there are a lot more community partners who are actively doing work and understand it, there's still a lot of work to be done still. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, oh gosh, I forgot it that fast. We're nearing the end of my workday, I can tell. Any other questions or comments for Danyelle?
Danyelle, I did have a question for you. So I work at Stepping Stone right here in Boone, and I'm actually completely new to the area. I come from Maryland, so much different atmosphere. I'm curious, are the statistics showing that the individuals that are being sex trafficked in the area, are they coming from outside and being brought here, or are they individuals that live here and are targeted?
Both. And so most often, then I would say about by the time that I left in December, 60%, maybe a little bit more, had been trafficked here in the area. And we still definitely have individuals who are then relocated, like they were trafficked in Charlotte, but then there was shelter space up here in the High Country or something like that, or for safety reasons, we relocated them. That also occurs, but absolutely clients that are.
Is there any correlation between like the major highways and there being, you know, this is off the beaten path?
Yeah, so most often than not, with my clients who've been trafficked here locally, most often it is a intersectionality with substance use, and it's more localized. So individuals who their trafficker is potentially a romantic partner who's in the area, who lives, like is from here also, or has been here for a while. It's not necessarily somebody from off the mountain who's then they're being trafficked here. It usually kind of stays within this region, like within the rural areas. And I think that's something that so often surprises folks because we are such a small rural community, but it's happening amongst our own community members and it's staying here, everything being localized here. It's not uncommon at times for individuals to go to larger cities when we're talking about sex trafficking. But even that, I would say I more often see that individuals are staying within the High Country counties too.
Okay, I was just curious because, like, for example, just 2 years ago in the area in Maryland I was living in, they actually had an FBI sting on a hotel where 90% of the hotel rooms were full of individuals that were being drugged and then sold. So with this being, you know, in a different community, different environment, different culture, are these individuals being held someplace? Are they, you know, like you said, they're a romantic partner that's maybe, you know, selling them out?
Yeah, and sometimes gang involvement. I've seen that as well, which, like, I know prior to doing this work, I was like, gang involvement in the high country, it exists.
They're unfortunately everywhere.
Yep, exactly. So, and I do think like what you're sharing as far as like in Maryland, we do see here in North Carolina, and especially like the program I was working for is a statewide program. And so it's definitely something that we see like in our larger cities. It looks different than what it looks like here in the high country. So we definitely work with clients that's been their experience. But when thinking about, you know, our local community members who are experiencing it, it typically is facilitated by like somebody who is acting as a romantic partner, or even a family member, unfortunately. Situations more like similar to that.
And is it often correlated? I think you mentioned this correlated with substance abuse.
Mm-hmm. I would say that the majority of my clients, there's an intersectionality with substance use.
Well, thank you so much. The presentation was very nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
I never mute myself, but the feedback's so bad I'm muting myself today. So we've got a couple 3 minutes for any last thoughts or questions, and then you're welcome to type a message to Danyelle in the chat. Anything I didn't ask you about, Danyelle, that you wanted to cover or forgot to mention or want to bring up? One last, you know, what's the biggest thing that you want us to take away?
You know, I think that, and I know I spent a good bit of time on this already, but really just wanting to drive home that we all can be activists in this field and learn and help with the prevention aspect of it. And that just really challenge everybody to, even on the hard days, find the worth in individuals. Because I think that's, you know, I think most often than not, my most challenging, actually not most often, almost always, my most challenging days were because of other service providers, not because of my clients' stories. My most challenging days were because another provider didn't want to, you know, didn't want to take the time or show that worth or, yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest things of like, I really pride myself in, you know, respecting all of my clients and seeing their worth and wanting to advocate for them no matter what. And it's disheartening when other providers are so burnt out or have their own implicit bias or whatnot. And so those, I think, just really challenging all of us, and that includes myself, to continue to do the self-work, to continue to be able to advocate for everybody. And, you know, we all may have our own different bias and we all come from different areas and may have our own triggers, but really just push everybody to continue to do the self-work, because I think that's so vital to be able to continue to show up for all of our community members, whether we're talking about human trafficking or anybody who's experienced trauma. And I know that that's one of the biggest things that a really great mentor of mine is constantly speaking into me is, you have to take care of yourself first, Danyelle, before you can take care of others. And so I think that's something that we all just need to remember, and also recognize that work isn't always going to be easy, and that we really need to challenge ourselves to continuously do better and keep showing up.
Well, we appreciate you very much and the work that you do and the lessons that you share with us. Thanks for taking time to be here with us today. And this will be recorded and put on our website. And I look forward to seeing everybody next week. So thank you, Danyelle. Good luck.
Thank you for having me.
Comes next in your future. And hope everybody's day goes well, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.